Do you know someone in foster care? Have you been in foster care? Do you have a child in foster care? Are you a grandparent or relative caring for a family member? Are you considering becoming a foster parent? Then tune in every Wednesday at 3 p.m. to Fresh Start Today on WNOV 860 AM to engage in thought-provoking conversations with families and providers about child welfare services, both locally and nationally. Together, we can save our children.
It's a great day at Fresh Start. This is Fresh Start Today. I'm your host, Jermaine Reed, and we have some special guests in the studio today. We have Dr. Paula Reiner and Dr. Carol Siri from UWM, and we're going to be talking about exploring the world of speech and language development in children. And so we're going to invite you all to participate in the conversation as we do every week by calling 414-444-5250, 414-444-5250. And again, we're talking about exploring the world of speech and language development in children. We know that by the end of this conversation, our goal is to ensure that the audience can help understand some of the characteristics around speech and language development, some of these age milestones to determine when children should be speaking, what they should be saying, or how they should be speaking. We'll also talk about some of the language and speech disorders. We'll also define some terms that's specific to the world of speech and language, like enunciation, pronunciation. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Pronunciation, and a couple other words that we'll have. We're going to go through a vocabulary list of words. And you can, again, join this conversation by calling 414-444-5250, 414-444-5250. According to Zibby Andrews, speech and language skills are at the root of your child's development, cognitive and social emotional development, and that each conversation that we have with our children creates an opportunity to add new words to their vocabulary. Now, there was a historic study that was done. We talked about Hart and Rissler, Dr. Reiner, and in that study, they were doing a comparison between low socioeconomic status children and high or middle class socioeconomic status children in terms of their word bank, how many words that they had acquired by the time they reached, it was something like kindergarten or first grade. And according to this, it's a classic study, and I understand that it's been disputed, but according to this study, supposedly there was like a 32 million word deficit, or what do you want to call it?
Gap.
A gap in language or vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to talk about today, can you talk about how important is language and speech development, in particular as it relates to vocabulary?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having us here.
Oh,
it's
great.
Very nice to be invited. When we talk about children's speech and language development, and your focus with the Hart and Risley study on vocabulary is an important piece of that, because speech and language, from our perspective, is the foundation for all learning in children, because there is so much that children acquire through their speech and language development, and it's very closely related to their development in all areas. Their motor development, their cognitive development, and their learning. So when we look at children's speech and language development, the earliest aspects of their speech and language to develop, in addition to learning how to make sounds, is learning how to associate meaning with words. So they might not be able to produce words, but they're learning the meanings of words, and they learn those meanings because the significant people around them, their parents, their caregivers, their siblings, aunts and uncles and grandparents, will oftentimes repeat the same words over and over again within different activities. So if it's snack time, they might be saying want juice, or those kinds of things. Even with an infant, if we're changing diapers, we might talk about you need a new diaper, you have a stinky diaper, did you wet your diaper, those kinds of things. And they're hearing the same words over and over again associated with the same activities and actions, and they learn to associate the meanings of the words even before they can say the words. So what the research has shown is that the amount of language that children hear from others, the number of words and the type of vocabulary that they hear, is important to their learning vocabulary.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this question as it relates to building this word bank or word economy in our children, and how important having extensive vocabulary is to their learning experience and their educational experience. Are there certain milestones, age markers, where parents should be looking to see maybe perhaps that children should be learning X amount of words by this particular age? I know what Zibby Andrews says, but can you kind of weigh in? Are there some milestones that we should be looking at?
So usually what we're looking at, the most easily observed kinds of behaviors are: when does a child produce their first word, when do they start combining words, and we always give an age range because there's such a range of what we would consider typical. So we look for in children that their first true words will appear somewhere between 12 and 18 months.
Between 12 and 18 months, okay.
Some children are saying their first words before 12 months. Some are saying their first words after 18 months. So we're talking about sort of an average. And the next milestone would be when they start to combine words. And so in order to combine words, their vocabulary has to be a good number of words that they understand and that they can use. And children usually understand far more words than they actually are producing. But we look for them to start putting words together somewhere between 18 and 24 months, or 24 and 36 months, somewhere in there, between 2 and 3. In order to be able to combine words, children, they usually start doing that when they have about 50 words that they will use, actually produce on their own.
So, Zibby Andrews, again, I'm taking into account what you're saying with these milestones. 12 to 18 months, children should be able to start producing
their first words.
Their first words. And Zibby Andrews was saying that by the age of 2, children should know at least 200 words, have 200 words in their vocabulary bank. By the time they are 3 years old, that number explodes to anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 words. And although they have 2,000 to 3,000 words in the vocabulary bank, they should be able to use at least 1,000 of those words in some type of sentence form. I want milk, I want to eat, or something of that nature, okay? According also to Zibby Andrews, this person was indicating that in terms of the lifespan, by the time a child or young adult reaches college or is college ready, they should have about 80,000 words in their vocabulary bank. So that's a lot of words. And so we have to really focus on building the vocabulary, which is important to speech and language development. Let me ask you this: how much impact or influence, or how much speech and language development occurs in utero?
That's a good question. There are some studies trying to address that question.
Right.
How important is it for a child in utero to be hearing words, to be hearing people talking? What I have seen in terms of the type of research that's been done is that a lot of the research has to do with what do children recognize after they're born with regard to words and sounds and things. And so some of the research shows that right at birth, children have a preference for their mother's voice
Okay.
because they've heard it so much in utero. They may also show a preference for their father's voice, but in general, they also show a preference for a female voice
Okay.
right after they're born. And then, again, as they spend more time with the significant people in their lives, they're really focusing in on those voices and attending to what they're hearing in terms of words from those individuals.
Okay. So you are a speech pathologist?
Speech language pathologist.
Speech language pathologist. Is that the same as a speech therapist?
Yes.
Those synonymous terms? Okay, so can you talk about what is the role of a speech pathologist, or what is speech therapy?
Okay, she's referred to me to answer that question. This is Dr. Siri. A speech-language pathologist is someone who is concerned with the assessment and treatment of communication and swallowing disorders. And the area of communication disorders ranges from the production of the speech sounds and whether or not people have the capacities to produce those. Sometimes children have trouble developing their abilities to produce sounds. Adults secondary to stroke or neurological injuries of various kinds may have trouble producing sounds. Then we have language types of disorders that are problems with putting the words together and using words to mean what they want to say. So that's another aspect of what we assess and address. And then there's aspects of how we're making our speech, which depends on voice, which is just the sound of the vocal structures, and starting with the vocal folds and how they're moving and the source of sound that is necessary to make speech sounds.
So is that oral motor ability that you're describing right now, or is that something different?
Oral motor ability, oral means your mouth and motor means movements. So basically oral motor is about how are we moving our lips, our tongue, our jaw, the structures. We raise the soft palate in the back to close off the nasal cavity for most of the sounds we make, and sometimes we allow nasal resonance for some of the sounds and need to. So we have those aspects of oral motor production that supports the speech sounds we make. But the actual carrying sound that each of us has comes from the vocal cords or vocal folds making a kind of a buzz down in our necks, and that sets our vocal tracts, which are our throats and our mouths, into resonance. So it's resonating sounds, and then we shape the sounds by moving our lips and tongue and so forth to make various speech sounds.
Okay.
And so as I'm saying, ah, and most of our vowels are all just vocalized, voiced types of sounds. So we are vocalizing, setting the throat and our mouths into a resonating chamber, as well as sometimes using nasal quality in our voice.
Okay.
And so voice is another aspect. Sometimes people have trouble with the quality of their voices. If they get way too rough and they are having trouble with their voice breaking up, then that interferes with their communication sometimes. And people may have underlying neurological problems that could lead to voice problems, or other, there are many kinds of factors that affect voice. And then there's also fluency problems, which is my area, which is where there's trouble with the flow of the speech production, so that there's interruptions and breaks, and the person doesn't have the capacity to maybe get speech out at the time they want.
What an example is an example of that stuttering?
Right.
Okay, so stuttering would be an example of that. Okay.
Right.
And so hopefully before this program is over, you all will be able to identify some speech and language disorders and some techniques that you all use to help improve, those skill sets. Can you define very clearly what is speech and what is language? Or are they one and the same?
They are different to a speech-language pathologist,
Okay.
although a lot of, people, the public often may use that interchangeably, those two terms. But for us, speech refers to the the aspects of the sound we produce, which include the voice and the speech production, the way we move our structures to make sounds happen.
Okay.
That's the speech part, okay?
Okay.
The language part is when we have a symbolic representation for the various sounds and the words that we have. The symbol system is the language part. The fact that my sounds that I put together make the word cat that means something to somebody when I say it. That's the part of it that transitions into being the language. Whereas just the fact of making cat are these arbitrary sounds, and that's the speech part. The fact that we're making sounds with our vocal tracks.
All right, so you're listening to Fresh Start today. If you've just tuned into the program, and we are talking about exploring the world of speech and language development in children. Our special guest today is Dr. Paula Reiner and Dr. Carol Siri and Dr. Ramel Smith. We're going to take a break, and after this break, we're going to talk a little bit more about some vocabulary words and look at how trauma and some other factors may impact speech and language development. So we'll be right back. Good afternoon. You're listening to Fresh Start today. I'm your host, Jermaine, and we're talking about exploring the world of speech and language development in children with our special guests, Dr. Ramel Smith, Dr. Paula Reiner, and Dr. Carol Sear from UWM. Caller, JT, you're on the line?
Yes. Good afternoon, Jermaine.
Good afternoon, my friend. How you doing?
How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. You got a brief comment or question that you'd like to share today?
Yes, sir. And good afternoon to your guests.
Good afternoon.
Ladies. Just want to say good afternoon to you, and thank you for being there.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Jermaine,
Yes.
thank you for having this show, as usual, sir. What I want to say, though, you was talking about different languages and stuff like that.
Yes.
We know that when it comes to that, when it comes to languages, poor people in Africa, they know 3 languages. And ladies, I'm not lying about this.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to survival and knowing languages, they know that anyway. When they're born as a child, it's called survival. And when they're born, whatever condition that they're in, they know languages 3 more than we do in the United States. So we try to still get the language right here in the United States and get it right and stuff like that. But ladies, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate you being there and saying that for real and being honest about that. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, there are poor people in this world that know, based on survival, they know languages when they first come out. And one of you honorable ladies said earlier that when a baby come out, they hear sounds, they hear stuff. They hear that. They hear that. Their parents, wherever they are from, they hear their parents speaking. But when it comes down to survival, they know other languages that's going to help them to survive in whatever incident, the predicament they are in. So I might be going all over the pages and stuff like that, ladies. Respectfully speaking, I thank you for being there honestly and just telling the truth. When it comes to languages and stuff like that, we learn languages based on our predicament. Mm-hmm. We learn languages on our survival. There are, like I said, excuse me for reiterating. I beg your pardon.
All right. JT, we're going to have to wrap it up so we can get to the ladies.
Yes, sir. Let me wrap it up real quick.
All right.
Thank you, Jermaine.
No
problem,
problem.
sir. Thank you. Let me wrap it up real quick.
Okay.
Ladies, thank you for being there. I understand what you're saying. But what can we do here in America to not only in languages and stuff like that? What can we do to survive? Because we know how to speak all kind of stuff.
All right. Thanks a lot, JT.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to make one point because he actually brings up an important point, and that is that the studies of newborns have actually shown that they can discriminate the sounds of different languages at birth. And that ability decreases with age as they get a little bit older and they start learning their whatever language their primary language. So he's actually correct.
Well, wow, that's interesting. So, do you all know why infants are able to differentiate between the different languages, and then that kind of dissipates over time? Is there?
Well, one of the things when the brain is first developing, you have like billions of neuronal synaptic connections, and so basically what that is the way that your brain talks. It's one of those things, so if you don't use it, you lose it. So as we get older, those synaptic connections start to fall off. And so that ability that you had to learn so quickly in the beginning, think of it like wet cement, where the cement was wet and could still be easily shaped. As it gets older, as it goes longer, it becomes more hardened. And so the ability not to only learn languages, but other things during that first expansive years, really the first 5 years when the brain is just exploding with what we call the absorbable mind at that time. As you get older, it becomes increasingly more difficult to pick something up. But in those early years, because you have all of these connections, possibly learning, trying to do it. Think of it from a computer standpoint. You have all of these connections that's going on. But now if I take out a specific flash drive, that's no longer there. But if it's there in the beginning and I can get it in a hard drive where it's wired in, it doesn't matter if it's in a flash drive or not. It's just there and it's inside of the internal system.
So let me ask you this. When we have in the foster care community, let's just say a Hispanic woman or Latino woman gives birth to a child, and that child is removed from the hospital and is placed in an African American home. That is why I was asking in terms of how much of language and speech is developed in the womb. So is it going to be difficult or easier for that child to learn this other language? And let's just say that the birth parent was speaking, their primary language was Spanish. Is it going to be more difficult or easier for that child to learn the language of these non-Hispanic or non-Latino parents if they're speaking a different language? Or is it easier? And is that why it's easier for us to learn a second language when we're younger versus when we're older? Anybody?
So you actually are asking a good question. I would say in terms of actual research that's been done looking at ease of learning a language from birth that was not your biological mother's primary language. I haven't seen a lot of research on that. I would say that if we're talking about a child who is basically typically developing, they should have no problem learning that language. And the other part speaks to the plasticity of the brain, which you may be able to talk about a bit more from the psychology perspective.
You want me to speak on that now? Sure. Well, when you talk about plasticity of the brain, that just means the wonderful ability of the brain to heal itself, basically. So if any of us as adults had a traumatic brain injury, there was some type of assault to our head, there was a car accident, we were hit with a blunt object or anything like that, we would lose a lot of our memory, a lot of our function, and our ability to remember, to be able to even remember to speak. But through proper training, the brain rewires itself in what it says. So it's like the brain has a wonderful ability. However, when you start talking about rewiring, speech is one of those things that can be retrained and retaught. And that's the beautiful part about the brain. So even when you're talking about a child from birth, we talk about the mom's soothing voice in the beginning. The trauma would come from maybe not having the original mom there.
Okay,
the voice
so that could be traumatic.
But as it relates just to picking up the language, we had stated before that babies can speak in multiple language, whatever they hear. You go into homes where 4 and 5 languages are spoken. If those languages are spoken consistently, and I've been in homes where you will have a grandparent speak only in one language, one of the parents, the mom speaking one specific language, the dad speaking specific language, and you're amazed at how the child can pick those up.
All
so with
those
that
languages
absorbable mind, as long as the key word is as far as that person being thoroughly immersed in that language where it's consistent and it's constant, where it has the ability to really train it. You're not going to hear something one time and then just because you're a baby and you have these connections, you're going to have it. It still has to be done in a regular time. If we're talking that we're expecting the first words anywhere from 8 to 18 months, you got to understand it takes time for everything to come. But I think also what we said is sometimes we can understand before we can verbalize and articulate. So sometimes you will even have kids that's within MPS, that's in the Hispanic community. They can't speak Spanish, but they can understand it. So it's different things that have been transferred where it just
And
didn't
so
go
from
all
a
the way.
speech pathologist perspective, what is going there when you can understand words but you can't speak them? What is that called? Something aphasia?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about someone who has already acquired language and then lost it.
Okay.
Or if you're talking, for example, about a child who's able to, which is often what we see in children who have language delays, is that they have no difficulty understanding the language that they're hearing, but they're having the difficulty in actually producing the language.
So that's a speech problem.
So we talk about it, expressive and receptive languages.
Right.
Receptive
Okay.
being what comes in, we can understand it, but how to
Expressive, what goes out.
articulate what goes out, the expressive part.
Right.
Right, but from a speech pathologist standpoint, where we talk about, this person is not able to recall, they understand what is being said, the command that you're giving, or the, what you call it, the inception? Or
Expressive, receptive is what comes in.
But receptive what comes in and expressive what goes out. So if they understand what's coming in, but I don't have the ability, or I'm having difficulty communicating orally what you've said, what is that called right there?
That's expressive language.
Expressive language.
Disorders.
Okay. So now for parents who just a typical everyday parent, and they have a child, and are there certain characteristics that they can be looking for that will either be indicative that there is a language delay or disorder? Is there the same thing, a difference between language disorder and language delay? Are they one and the same? Because I think from your perspective and from my perspective, we had children who had some speech or language issues, but we weren't able to identify them right away. In my case.
Yeah. Well, with mine, the first thing what I always tell parents, I try to rule out anything organic. And so what we did is we had speech, we had hearing tests, and that's one of the things that you often do. And so for my youngest twin, he had some weird thing, and I don't remember what it's called. It was this crazy wax buildup where we had to literally scrape get his ears like rinsed out because the plaque buildup was so big. So that had something to do with what he was hearing and processing and whatnot.
So hearing loss. Okay.
So when you say how can you know, you don't always know, but when you see that there's something not going on correctly, what I always tell parents is I try to rule out everything organic to see as much as I can from that standpoint. And I think that's my first step.
Okay.
Right. So there are certain conditions that will increase a child's risk of having a language delay or a language disorder. And when we talk about a delay, we're talking about children who are basically following a typical sequence in terms of the order in which they're acquiring language. They're just doing it at a slower rate.
Okay.
And children who have a disorder are not necessarily following a normal or a typical sequence. They have errors that are different than what we might see in a child who's acquiring language in a typical way. So when we talk about the condition, so for example, hearing loss, or oftentimes young children have ear infections.
Okay.
And when they have those ear infections, it's almost like having your fingers in your ears if your ears are plugged up, and they're not hearing language in the same way, and that could affect their ability to learn language. Children who are born with certain conditions like Down syndrome or
autism.
Right.
Okay.
So they have a much greater risk of having a language delay or a language disorder. In most cases, when we're talking about young children who are delayed in their language development, we usually can't identify the cause.
Okay.
We usually don't know.
So we're talking about cause. Now let's talk about trauma and its influence or its impact on speech and language development. Who would like to contribute there about trauma, its impact, or how it influences?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the ACE studies, the adverse childhood experience, everything kind of goes back to that. We talk about what happened early and crucial in those early years. So if there was some type of sustained trauma to the person, that trauma can manifest in different ways. And one of the things come in delays and disorders in various fashions. And so we're speaking specifically today about speech and language. One of the things what we look at is select mutism, which most people don't think of as like a disorder per se, but when one just chooses to shut down and not speak, it's a disorder in itself, one that needs some type of therapy, some type of time, some type of help to bring the person back out to speak. So you try to figure out what exactly it was that caused a person to speak. Off air, me and you had talked about the discipline of a parent, some of the things that could happen. Now, obviously, with physical abuse, we've had people who've had traumatic brain injuries, who've had hearing loss, things of that nature that affected it. So when we go into physical abuse, we have some different things that can happen organically that can affect the hearing. But when we talk about the emotional abuse that most people sometimes don't think about, because those are one of those kind of invisible type of assaults and insults that the brain can take, those are one of the things we spoke about was a newborn baby. One of the ways in which they speak before words are developed is through crying. And if a baby cry is not heard, what they are taught by the brain is no matter what I say, it doesn't do me any good. So some will cry louder and cry more often, be very colicky, and some will take the opposite path where they'll be very quiet, and that transfer all the way up. You'll have some parents who will think that their child cannot talk, and then the child says something, and they say, where did that come from? So that kind of goes into the selective mutism. I've been trained not to do something, and because I don't present it, I don't say it because of the past trauma. It just looks like I can't because I've been resistant to any type of training or any type of therapy that has been brought my way, if any has been at all.
But other forms of trauma could be shaken baby.
Yeah.
Right. Or
and
even
that goes
dropping
to the physical assault, physical abuse.
Okay. So we talked about positive communication with your child is very essential to brain development, language, and speech development. So we strongly encourage parents to have positive communications with their children. Okay, so we're going to take a break, but when we come back, what I would like to talk about, alternate language forms. And so when we look at, now there's this thing about African American English / Ebonics versus powwow Onyx and Feather Onyx and Chico Onyx, and there's a whole lot of Onyx that's out there, but its impact on English, its impact on school performance. And so we'll be back right after this break. You're listening to Fresh Start Today with Jermaine. You're listening to Fresh Start Today. I'm your host, Jermaine Reed, and we're talking about exploring the world of speech and language pathology, and we have guests in the studio today, Dr. Ramel Smith, Dr. Carol Siri, and Dr. Reiner from UWM. And we're talking, well, before we went off, we were talking about a number of things, but I want to talk about the alternate forms of language. We know that the American economy, the American public education system, the commerce world, everything is built on the standard English language. So my question, my concern is when we start looking at alternate forms of language, how does that impact the learning, but also life outcomes later in life? How well kids do in school? Are they their ability to attain a job or to run a business if the standard English language is the foundation of all of these systems? Is Ebonics, or the African American English, is that a recognized form of language? That's the question.
So we would actually refer to that as a dialect.
A dialect. Okay. Now, what is a dialect?
It's a
different type.
It's a different. I don't want to. It's a different type of language within
So subculture, like a sub-language?
Right. I was avoiding using the word sub because I think that has a negative connotation. But, you know, we can talk about regional dialects.
Okay.
You know, you mentioned Southern dialect. Where I grew up in Pittsburgh, it was a Southwest Pennsylvania dialect. So when I came here, people had a hard time understanding me. So I had to learn to change some things.
Okay.
About how, either how I pronounced some words, or even in terms of some of the terms. So when I came here, I didn't know what a bubbler was. I'd never heard that.
It was a water fountain?
Right, right. That's what I was. I would say I need to find a right. Okay. And if I had said I need a gum band, people wouldn't know what it was. So I had to learn that I couldn't call it a gum band. It's a rubber band.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So the point to be made about dialects is that they're just different. And so a child that's using a particular dialect, if their language development is following a typical sequence, progression, and there are cultural influences, it's just a difference. It's not a disorder. Okay. And that's what we have to recognize and accept and promote. And when you talk about children's success, there are questions that you have to ask, if my child is going to be successful in school, is it important for them to learn to use standard English? And if that's the dialect of the school, they'll need to be able to use that. And children are very good at learning to do what's called code switching.
Okay. So in terms of how the geographical location of birth in the domestic life, in how it influences speech and language skills and development, and also school performance. Dr. Robert Lee Williams, and you were talking about this offline, had produced a study. It was
an intellectual test. It didn't really pass all the reliability and validity measures to be considered an actual test. But what he was just trying to show was what we spoke about, that you can't call something that's different a deficit. And so what he did is he said we were basing all of our standardized tests on standard white American middle class society. So when a black kid from a lower SES background took it, it was foreign to him. But when you gave a kid a test with things that were familiar to him, and he compared that with 50 black students towards 50 white students, the black students far exceeded because they were talking in a language that was much far more comfortable to them and situations that were familiar.
So an example there would have been, for a child to say, I'm finna go to the store, I'm finna do my homework. And if that child was giving a test and the word finna was not on it, F-I-N-N-A, I think that's how I would spell it, finna, or I ain't about to do this. And if they don't see that word on that test, and finna is actually I'm about to. So is there a possibility that child would fail that test if they didn't identify, if they couldn't make the association that I'm about to is also finna?
I think that's part of what he was saying, but it's just about what's given to a person, making sure that the tests were fair. And so, as we had stated, unfortunately what happens with a lot of kids from lower SES backgrounds, different ethnic minority backgrounds, you have to be able to code switch. You have to be bi-dialectical. You have to be able to speak a dialect in which you're in the comfort of your own familiar environment that you can speak, but also when you go out towards the more mainstream society, if you want to fit into that society or be allowed in it, and to some extent you have to be able to understand how to speak. It's just the difference between speaking French and Spanish. If you have a friend who speaks French and you speak Spanish to them because you can, there's going to be some miscommunication. So you want to be able to speak whatever language that person speaks. And so what we have to do is to teach specifically our young people not to be, sometimes they would think of themselves a sellout if they spoke in different manners. But what I think it is just really an extreme form of variation as far as of intelligence, showing that I can have almost like multiple language. I can do multiple dialect. But what you'll see most people who are influent, specifically, let's say the African American community, there's a way to speak in a standard American English vernacular while still showing the roots to your African American culture where everybody knows and understands. So it's clear that I can speak this, but also I'm proud of my roots. So whether we're from Boston or whether we're from some other place that has a strong accent, I can speak in the way in which you can understand, but I'm still going to put my flavor on it so you understand fully where I'm at and where I stand.
So is there a way that parents and school systems can respect the standard English language while honoring or embracing the diversity alternate language
publishers
forms?
do. One of the best books I read was Nathan McCall, Makes Me Want to Holler. And inside of it, you will see words like ain't, can't, finna. It allowed him to be able to express his vocabulary, express his words in a way in which he would articulate it in a phonetic sense. So if the publishers can recognize that, I don't see why the education system can. I think it's a matter of not seeing one or the other. But your difference is not a deficit, but understanding. Like my mother, if I would say something, you ain't gonna do something. Okay, Ma, I'm not. She just wanted to make sure I knew both. So she said, you can say this.
So this
long as I know
that's
you
the
can
code
flip
switching
it.
that you're talking about.
Right.
So at what point does an alternate form of language, an alternate language form becomes a deficit? You know, is there at some point that it can become a deficit if you don't know what the standard language is, or, you know, because this child, let's just use foster child, that's in my care that has some challenges with speech or language. And I know that I need to prepare this individual for life, for the real world. And I want him to go out and get a job. How do I help him? Because he can't go in talking.
I mean, it's a hypocritical nature of America, because if you're a rapper, you come in talking to corporate America any way you want to. But now, so you say, now what about the person who's not a rapper, who's not an entertainer, who
and that's
doesn't
the
have those
majority of the population, though.
No, and so
Right.
then the question becomes, well, what do you do? Well, that's why we see the problems that we see here, because it's a form of America as far as assimilation, and if you don't assimilate, then you're annihilated in a sense. If you don't want to assimilate into our views, then you consider yourself to be an outsider, and then you get the results of that behavior, the ability or refusal to conform to what we consider to be mainstream behavior.
Okay. So for parents, Dr. Reiner, Dr. Sear, for parents who may have a child who has a speech or language delay, are there ways that they can prevent that? And if so, what are those?
Well, I was thinking earlier about the fact that actually by the time a child is 3 years old, or when they're past the age of 3, you should be able to understand most of what they're saying. They should, they're going to have still a few sounds they're misproducing that are from the targets, but overall you should be able to understand them. So if that's kind of a point at which, if you're not understanding them, most of the time you can't communicate with them, and then you might need help from someone who understands and can assess the difficulties. So prevention-wise, you really just want to provide multiple opportunities for children to hear the target vocabulary and words that you're producing to communicate with them. Just expose them to the language. So, you're talking about, there's a dog. The dog is brown. Tell you about the dog. He can run. He can, you just keep talking and just giving the child as much exposure to all the different kinds of things that they might be wanting to later convey to somebody else about what they learn and know about things, because the whole goal of communication is that we have ideas or our thoughts in our minds, and we want to have somebody else understand that and share that. And so that's the goal of our speech and our language, is we've turned our ideas into symbols, these speech sounds. We want someone else to get it, so and coming the other way then, we want to listen as much as we can. And when a child is attempting to make sounds, to the extent we can kind of, go with what they're trying to say and say it back to them, reflect back to them. Well, maybe they're even saying it in a way that we don't quite understand everything, but try to do the best we can to say back to them, are you saying this? And go with what topic we think they're trying to go on, rather than just only communicating one way with them, thinking we've got to tell them everything. Listen back and kind of get on their page and talk about the topics they want to talk about.
I would add to that too that my area is child language development disorders from birth to about 5 years. So I often see preschool children, usually if a child hasn't started talking when they're about 2 years old, that's when parents become concerned.
Okay.
So, and I would say anytime a parent is concerned, call somebody, because it's better to at least have someone say, well, let me ask you some questions and see what's going on, and then maybe we can figure out whether you want to have your child evaluated or if you want to wait a little bit. So to do that, the other piece is that when we're talking about very young children, it is important to talk with your child. And if you think about what does your child actually say when they're talking on their own, how many words are they putting together, if you model language that's just a little bit more complicated, complex than what they're saying. So if you have a child who's not yet talking, then, and you will see this in, we've observed this over and over again in parents who are raising typically developing children, they'll usually use, 1 and 2 word, 3 word phrases. You don't have to produce long and complete sentences because they can't hold all of that in their memory. So if you have a child who's putting 2 words together, you can take it up a little bit and model 3 and 4 word sentences. So, and give them time to process what you've said so that you're not talking constantly to the child.
Okay. So for parents who have a child who has speech problems, and you have your language problems, what are some, let's just say it's articulation issue. What are some strategies that a parent could use at home? Practical tips right now and today that may be helpful in helping build their articulation skills.
Well, you want to give them, again, more exposure to the particular types of sounds that they may be having trouble with. So let's say they're not yet producing words that start with the S sound or something. Just, sometimes just using those words over and over again, saying them, different words to them, just gives it a chance to get into their heads, because you don't necessarily want to be trying to make them say it by just saying, well, say that over again and say, because you're probably just going to be beating your head against the wall, to be frank, because if they're not getting it, how they're supposed to say it, they're not going to do it just from having somebody say it to them. But giving them a chance to hear it over and over helps to get the image more strong in their minds, and they need lots of exposures to that.
What about sucking on popsicles? Does that help with work on the inside of the mouth, or is it?
Only if a child were to actually maybe have weakness of their lips, and you're trying to work, at a very, pre-speech kind of level of getting strength in the lips, then maybe strengthening the lips. But most kids have adequate strength in the lips, and it doesn't really take much lip strength to actually get the sounds that we need going. Okay. So, yeah.
So that's great. So my last question is going to be going back to education. How does a speech disorder increase the risk of a child having a learning disability?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that in what we know is that children who are delayed in their language development early on, it does place them at a greater risk for language and learning problems. It doesn't guarantee that they'll have those problems. Okay. But it's something to be aware of. They may have some reading difficulties later on, in terms of learning how to read. So you just want to be aware of it. But that's why, from my perspective, and I know from my colleagues' perspectives here, we focus on getting help or intervention as soon as possible. The sooner the better, because it just gives the child a better chance at staying on track or getting on track and keeping up.
Well, thank you all for tuning in to Fresh Start today. A special thank you to Dr. Ramel Smith, Dr. Paula Reiner, and Dr. Carol Siri from UWM. Appreciate you all taking the time out to discuss this topic about exploring the world of speech and language development in children. And Dr. Smith, you had referenced a study by Robert Lee Williams II that was the Black Intellectual Test of Cultural Homogeneity. Okay, folks want to look that up, they can. Thank you all for tuning in to Fresh Start today, and we'll be talking to you next week.